Is in the room yet, and they're still getting their coffee. But I think it's important that we try to keep on with our timetable. So I'm Richard Denton. I'm just a country doctor up in Kirkland Lake, and our next session is on radiation exposure and the crisis of radiation.
Can't see the screen. Yeah, turn it out.
So, I just wanted to say a little bit, as a country doctor, I do see the problems of radiation. I look after people with developmental disabilities. Radiation causes Down syndrome. It causes aging. It increases the aging process. And certainly here in this room, we can all see that. But it also causes mutagenesis. It affects genes. It causes teratogenesis, which is physical disabilities, and it causes cancer in various specific organs such as the thyroid and breast, bladder. We know that children are much more sensitive to radiation. We know that women are 40 times more sensitive to radiation. So I could go on at length of talking just about the medical consequences of radiation, but it's important to hear our specialists this morning. And these are two very dynamic activists who I have known for many years. Gordon Edwards came up to Kirkland Lake in the early 80s when we were dealing with low-level and then high-level nuclear waste that they wanted to put in our mines up there. And he helped us to prevent that. He is an honorary expert with our group Physicians for Global Survival. And we've sponsored him talking in Greenland and in York, England. And he's spoken at our World Uranium Symposium. So Gordon himself, he's received a gold medal from U of T here in mathematics back when he was doing his two master's degrees and his PhD. He's co-founder of the Canadian Coalition of Nuclear Responsibility. And he's been on David Suzuki's The Nature of Things, and he received the Rosalie Bertrell's award, Lifetime Achievement Award, as well as the Nuclear Free Future Award. He also, for those of you who remember, Pierre Berton was also on the Great Debate. So I would like to introduce Gordon Edwards.
Bravo.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for that kind introduction, and I feel honored to be included, albeit by remote control. I hope that my remarks, which will only be about 10 minutes, will touch on a few points that might be helpful. Because a crippled nuclear reactor is dangerous not due to its invisible rays, but because it disseminates harmful radioactive pollutants. So I prefer to use the word radioactivity rather than radiation. So what is radioactivity? Well, it's not a thing, but a property of certain materials. While there are a handful of significant naturally occurring radioactive materials, there are over 1,000 human-made radioactive materials. Most of these were not seen in nature in measurable amounts prior to 1939. When they talk about background radiation, it doesn't include most of these materials. They are created in large quantities as byproducts of nuclear fission, whether in bombs or in nuclear reactors. Each of these hundreds of radioactive elements has its own particular physical and chemical properties, therefore each following its own distinct ecological pathways through the environment and biochemical pathways through the body. Every radioactive atom has an unstable nucleus that will eventually disintegrate or explode, giving off one or two subatomic projectiles. And of course, the becquerel unit of radioactivity indicates one disintegration is occurring every second. Each radioactive emission coming directly from the nucleus is one of four kinds: an alpha particle, a beta particle, a gamma ray, or a neutron. These projectiles are all ionizing, meaning that they are able to break molecular bonds quite easily, thereby killing or crippling nearby living cells. If the cell is crippled, it can reproduce and possibly develop into a biologically harmful cluster later in life, which we generally call cancer. Alpha and beta particles are primarily internal hazards because they are less penetrating, whereas gamma rays and neutrons are both external as well as internal hazards because they are highly penetrating. A large exposure to any of these types of radioactive emissions can cause death within days or weeks, while chronic low-level exposures over time can cause cancers years later. Damage to eggs or sperm can lead to genetically defective offspring, as Richard mentioned. Such defects can appear in the immediate offspring or in several generations after the original cellular damage. Chronic exposure to radioactivity can also compromise the immune system, increase the incidence of cardiovascular diseases, cause a decrease in intelligence among young children, and, as Richard also mentioned, accelerate the aging process. Most sources of radiation, non-ionizing or ionizing, in our experience, can be shut off with a switch. An X-ray machine, a microwave oven, a tanning bulb, all can be turned off quickly. And once they are off, they are absolutely harmless. Not so with radioactivity. Radioactivity is, in fact, a form of nuclear energy that cannot be shut off. That is why meltdowns can occur even after a nuclear reactor is completely shut down. 3 Mile Island and Fukushima are examples of this. Ongoing radioactive disintegrations in the core of the reactor provide enormous heat and drive the temperature of the fuel up to 2,800 degrees Celsius, twice the melting point of steel, just due to radioactive disintegrations alone. At that temperature, the ceramic fuel begins to melt like candle wax. Because radioactivity cannot be shut off, the effects of radioactive contamination can be very long-lasting, leaving, for example, no man's lands around the Chernobyl site, the Fukushima site, the Marshall Islands test areas, and the site of the Kishtim disaster over 60 years ago in the Ural Mountains of the USSR. When it comes to radioactive waste, since radioactivity cannot be shut off or rendered harmless, waste disposal is actually a euphemism for waste abandonment. Nuclear agencies say that waste disposal means that they have no intention to retrieve the stuff. But that's not a scientific definition, that's a political definition. In fact, there is no scientific definition of disposal. The long-term confinement of radioactive post-fission waste remains an unsolved problem of mammoth proportions. Catastrophe potential. In 1976, British nuclear physicist Sir Brian Flowers wrote a report for the UK government on nuclear energy and the environment. In it, he pointed out that if nuclear energy had been deployed in Europe before the outbreak of World War II, then large parts of Europe would be uninhabitable today because of World War II. That's because Chernobyl-like meltdowns can be brought about by acts of malice, warfare, or sabotage, even if the reactor is shut down. It is estimated that the Chernobyl accident released about 80,000 terabecquerels of cesium-137, just one of the many radioactive materials released. A becquerel is 1 disintegration per second, as I mentioned, and of course a terabecquerel is a million becquerels. For 20 years after the Chernobyl accident, sheep farmers in northern England and Wales could not freely sell their sheep meat for human consumption because of residual radioactive contamination by cesium-137 from Chernobyl. To this day, wild boars killed by hunters in Germany, Sweden, and Belarus are unfit for human consumption because of radioactive cesium contamination. The same thing is observed with wild boars in the Fukushima area of Japan. Cesium-137 is a powerful emitter of penetrating gamma rays as well as a gamma emitter. Ground concentrations of cesium-137 are often used to decide which areas need to be evacuated. Around Chernobyl, it is expected that land in a 30-kilometer radius will be uninhabitable for at least 300 years. Now just think, there are 2.5 million people living within 30 kilometers of Pickering. Can you imagine that radius, those families being permanently displaced, and that land would become uninhabitable for centuries? A single irradiated CANDU fuel bundle, freshly discharged from the reactor, can deliver a 100% lethal dose of radiation to any unshielded human at a distance of 1 meter in about 20 seconds. And there are over 2,500 such bundles in each Pickering reactor. Moreover, there are over 400,000 irradiated fuel bundles in the Pickering spent fuel pools underwater, being cooled because they continue to generate heat. They have to be cooled for about 10 years. These pools contain at least 4 million terabecquerels of cesium-137. That's 50 times the amount of cesium-137 that was released from Chernobyl, which was about 80,000 terabecquerels. Now, if, for example, God forbid, a nuclear explosion were to occur near the Pickering plant, the water in the pool would be vaporized by the fireball, the zirconium metal cladding on the fuel bundles would catch fire, and virtually all of the cesium-137 would escape into the atmosphere in the form of radioactive vapors and aerosol particles. That would create a no man's land of mammoth proportions by releasing 50 times more cesium-137 than the amount released from the Chernobyl disaster. And these spent fuel pools, not only at Pickering, but all around the world, are not protected with very heavy structures, unlike the dome of the reactor building, which is very thick concrete. This is not the case with spent fuel pools. So frightening as these considerations are, we have to think about the long-lasting implications. At Fukushima, 7 years after the triple meltdown, now we're 7 years later, there are some 800,000 tons of radioactively contaminated water that the nuclear authorities would like to simply dump into the Pacific Ocean. In fact, they're building one new 300-ton tank per day. No, sorry, not per day, for every 4 days. They used to be building one per day about 3 years ago. They have now removed about 70 different species of radionuclides from this water, but they cannot remove the radioactive tritium. That's because radioactive tritium is chemically identical to ordinary hydrogen. It is incredibly difficult to separate a radioactive isotope from a non-radioactive isotope of the same element, because chemically they're like Siamese twins. Wherever one goes, the other one goes. Tritium is radioactive hydrogen, and it forms radioactive water molecules, which are identical with ordinary water molecules, except that they are radioactive. No municipal water treatment plant can remove the tritium because you cannot filter water from water. Also, because hydrogen is one of the most common elements in living things, being present in all organic molecules, for example, including DNA molecules, radioactive tritium becomes incorporated into all living things, and some fraction of it is organically bound into all sorts of molecules in the body. It has been known for decades that tritium is at least 3 times more biologically harmful than gamma radiation per unit of energy absorbed by tissue, but our nuclear regulator pays no attention to that fact. Indeed, 2 independent scientific bodies appointed by the Government of Ontario have found that the permissible levels of tritium in drinking water is about 350 times too high currently in Canada, compared with other cancer-causing agents that are regulated. But again, our nuclear regulatory machinery pays no attention to such inconvenient scientific truths. But this example of tritium points to a much larger problem. Nuclear fission creates radioactive versions of many elements that are otherwise non-radioactive, such as cesium, strontium, gold, silver, tellurium, magnesium, and countless others. Once these radioactive varieties are disseminated into the environment in significant quantities, they become inseparable from the non-radioactive varieties. While most of the naturally occurring radionuclides, like uranium, thorium, radium, and polonium, are chemically distinct and can therefore be separated out by chemical means from non-radioactive materials. Such is not the case with the deluge of human-made radioactive elements created by fission. Already, it is proving very difficult to find uncontaminated metals with which to fabricate radiation monitors, such as Geiger counters. Evidently, if the metal from which the monitor is made is already radioactive, it will interfere with the operation of the machine, making it increasingly difficult to determine where the radioactive emissions are coming from. There are many other important topics about radioactivity, but time does not permit. I'll just mention two of them. Number one, half-lives can be very deceptive, as some radioactive materials become more radioactive as time goes on, not less. Examples include radon gas, depleted uranium, and even irradiated nuclear fuel after 50,000 years. And plutonium, which has a 24,000-year half-life, when it disintegrates, transforms into another material, which has a 700 million-year half-life. So half-lives can be deceptive. The second point is that some radioactive materials are very difficult to detect, even in a well-equipped nuclear plant, because they give off non-penetrating radiation, yet they can be extraordinarily dangerous inside the body. Examples are carbon-14 dust, which workers at Pickering tracked into their homes in the 1980s, and plutonium-bearing dust, which over 500 contract workers inhaled on a daily basis for almost 3 weeks at Bruce in 2009. And my time is up, and so I'll just stop there, and thank you for your attention. Open for questions.
Okay, is Angela here? Yep, there we are. Okay, can you just hold on there, Gordon?
Yes, I'm here.
I'll introduce Angela, I'll have her speak, and then we'll open it up for discussion to the two of you.
Perfect.
Okay, again, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce our next guest, who is a dynamic activist and advocate for the environment. She has been in Edmonton, in Halifax, and now we are lucky to have her here in Toronto. Again, I've known Angela for many years. She is a collaborative team player. She worked with the Ontario Clean Air Alliance along with CAPE, Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario, to get our provincial government to get rid of the coal-firing generating plants. So she's got a proven track record. And now she puts out the No Nuke News. And I'll call on her now to talk about radiation as a crisis here in Ontario and in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Gordon. Gordon and I work together very closely on many issues, but he's the expert on radiation. I just want to bring it closer to home. Thank you for addressing Pickering, Gordon. Ontario is the second most nuclearized jurisdiction on the planet, second only to France. We get 60% of our electricity from nuclear power. We have 18 working nuclear reactors. The Bruce nuclear station is the largest nuclear station in the world. And Pickering, incredibly, is in the middle of the GTA. It would never get permission to build an 8-reactor nuclear station in the middle of the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area today. But because it was built years ago, decades ago, and it was supposed to close, it was only supposed to be open for 30 years, and so the population started growing around it. It is now 47 years old, and OPG is requesting a 10-year license extension. So the Ontario Clean Air Alliance has been working very courageously to call for the closure of all of Ontario's nuclear stations to be replaced with 100% renewable electricity, starting with the Pickering nuclear station. So it's old, it's surrounded within 30 kilometers by 2.2 million people, and we could easily replace it this August when its current license expires, just by importing water power from Quebec. We are very fortunate here in Ontario that we are beside one of the world's largest water power producers. And water power, you know, it's got its faults. I'm not saying I support more dams, but Quebec has dammed a large amount of their rivers, and they don't have a market for it. They were intending to send it to the Northeast United States. They are having difficulties building the transmission lines down there because of opposition to them. So, but we've already got the grid between the two provinces. And we have been negotiating deals. We've made a couple of deals with Quebec largely because of the advocacy of the Clean Air Alliance to do more interprovincial electricity exchange. And the Wynne government was negotiating a deal that was large enough to replace the Pickering nuclear station. But that, because of opposition, primarily from the Conservative opposition party, that she put that on hold, and also because politically it would not be really smart to close a large employer pre-election. But post-election, anything is up for grabs. And in fact, the NDP and the Green Party have both come out in support of closing the Pickering nuclear station in August and replacing it with water power from Quebec. Just a few more stats to add to what Gordon referred to in terms of the dangers of the Pickering nuclear station. We've been hiring experts around the world to produce reports for us, and if you're not already on my list, please do, and you can get on the list just by signing the petition to close the Pickering nuclear station, closepickering.ca, and there's leaflets over there, and take some extras and give them to your friends, because, you know, if that thing were to blow, we would probably all be evacuated. 30 kilometers from the Pickering nuclear station is Yonge Street. So that's a lot of people within, you know, a 50-kilometer radius of the Pickering station. But we hired Dr. Ian Fairley, a radiation biologist, who did a tritium report for us, which talked about the routine releases of tritium from the Pickering nuclear station. And he claimed that there are 100 kilograms of tritiated water vapor released every day from the Pickering nuclear station. And as you know, as Dr. Gordon Edwards mentioned, tritium is a carcinogen, teratogen, crosses the placental barrier, and a mutagen, causes genetic mutations. And he claimed in his report that we should not be eating food grown within 5 kilometers of the Pickering nuclear station, and women should not get pregnant within 10 kilometers of the Pickering nuclear station, because fetuses are much more radiosensitive. He also produced a report for us where he assumed that the Fukushima accident happened at Pickering, the same amount of release and the same wind patterns as what happened at Fukushima, which, as you know, is a much more rural location than the Pickering nuclear station. He said if that accident happened here at Pickering, of the same size, it would cause $125 billion just in homeowner insurance replacement. $125 billion. 650,000 people would be evacuated, and 22,000 people would get cancer, of which half would be fatal. These are pretty serious conclusions. And then we hired Dr. Gordon Thompson from Massachusetts, who did a study on what is, you know, the dangers of the waste at the Pickering nuclear station. You know, there are 18,000 tons of high-level nuclear waste at the Pickering nuclear station. As Gordon mentioned, some are in pools, others are in dry casks. The Pickering, OPG, the owner, which is owned by all of us in this room, Ontarians, they've requested an expansion of the nuclear waste facility to be able to hold 1.1 million fuel bundles. Gordon talked more about that. But by 2024, if we keep the station running as OPG has proposed, there will be 88,000 kilograms of plutonium at Pickering. And that is more than all the nuclear warheads in the world. You only need 4.5 kilograms of plutonium to create a nuclear bomb. So 88,000 kilograms. So he addresses in his report the dangers of having this facility in the middle of the GTA. So we're advocating that we close it in August when its license expires, replace it with lower cost, by the way, lower cost water power from Quebec, which would, in fact, lower our bills by $1 billion a year, because water power from Quebec is just almost half the price of the Pickering station, what it costs us just operating expenses alone. And then we're advocating, rather than rebuilding Darlington and Bruce, which is the current provincial plan, rebuilding all 4 reactors at Darlington and all 8 reactors at Bruce, of which 2 are already rebuilt and the 1 at Darlington is in the process of being rebuilt, locking us into high-cost nuclear power for the next 50 years. We should instead no new dollars put into nuclear power rebuilds and move to a renewable future, water power, wind, solar, geothermal, exchanges with Quebec, producing more renewable power in Ontario, conserving, lowering our demand. The world is moving to a renewable future. Ontario stands alone in rebuilding our aging nuclear infrastructure, locking us in for decades. It's time for us to go renewable, take these dangers away from our communities, and yes, so please, if you're not already getting my emails, I invite you to sign the petition. You'll be up to speed. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you very much, Angela. So now we will take questions. If you have questions, please direct your questions to our experts. Gordon's the expert on the physics and radioactivity. Angela is our advocate, and I can answer any medical questions. Okay, we'll start with you there, and then you, and over here.
Yes, I'm just wondering what the radiation that would be produced from thorium versus uranium. Has this been explored? I understand that there's been research done on thorium as an alternate nuclear energy source in the States up till 1973, but that according to my sources, it had been turned down because they couldn't produce bombs out of it. And apparently China's transitioning from plutonium uranium using plutonium fuel to transition to thorium as a backup for their hydropower.
Were you able to hear that, Gordon?
I wasn't. Could you repeat the gist of the question?
I think the gist of the question was, could you comment about using thorium instead of uranium for nuclear power, and also using plutonium in nuclear power as a way of using it up in your reactors?
Okay, well, this is a large topic, and one which has been close to the heart of the nuclear industry way back from the beginning in the 1940s. During the secret laboratory, part of the Manhattan Project on the slopes of Mount Royal, they were already talking about thorium as a possible fuel of the future, and also plutonium as a fuel of the future. And the reason why is because they knew they were going to run out of uranium. They knew that nuclear power could not last very long without a new fuel. Now, the trouble is with thorium is that it's not a fuel. It has to be mixed with something which is a fuel in order to be put into a reactor and breed a new artificial isotope of uranium called uranium-233. Uranium-233 is a fuel, but unfortunately, when it's created, it is 100% enriched and excellent weapons-grade material that can be used immediately in nuclear weapons, unlike today's fuel, which cannot. Today's fuel is natural uranium or low-enriched uranium, cannot be used in an atomic bomb. Uranium-233 is quite different. It can be used in an atomic bomb and has been used in an atomic bomb. Plutonium, needless to say, it falls into the same category. Once you start separating and using plutonium, anybody who steals even a fresh fuel bundle can actually extract that plutonium and use it for weapons purposes. Again, that's not the case with nuclear fuel today, but it would be the case if you were to use plutonium or thorium in the future. Just for historical reference, AECL, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, tried to get the Canadian government to spend billions of dollars building a plutonium reprocessing plant and a thorium reprocessing plant back in 1977. And they were defeated because the government followed the lead of Jimmy Carter in the United States and said, this is the wrong way to go. It just opens the door to criminal and terrorist organizations getting their hands on weapons usable material.
Okay.
I'm a retired chemical engineer. I hope that nuclear power was a possible solution for global warming. I have a few questions. Is the proposed cavern for storing can-do waste, would that improve the safety to what degree? Similarly, I'd read recently that there are fast neutron reactors, and I don't know the chemical engineering of that, which might treat can-do waste, and that they would be somewhat more safe. And finally, have there been any bombs or nuclear-powered submarines go down in the ocean? And if so, what is the ultimate fate of this nuclear contamination, let's say? Thank you.
Okay, you have 3 questions there.
Well, these are all big and kind of somewhat tangential questions, but important nevertheless. I might mention, by the way, that in 1978, when the Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning in Ontario held 3 years of hearings on the nuclear program, they concluded that it would be smart to build these reactors underground in the first place, to make them less vulnerable to attack, for example, and to ensure that even in the case of an accident, there might be a better chance of containing some of the radioactivity before letting it escape. Be that as it may, I think this is all kind of in the realm of wish we'd thought of that before. The trouble with fast nuclear reactors is that they also require access to weapons usable material. In order to run a fast nuclear reactor, but for those who don't know, a fast reactor is one where the neutrons are fast. They're not slowed down by a moderator. And that only works if you have weapons usable material. So once again, you get into that dangerous nexus between civilian nuclear power and militarily usable nuclear weapons materials. You can't have a fast reactor without getting into that game of commercializing nuclear weapons usable materials. And that's what we have avoided in the current generation of nuclear power without reprocessing. If we don't reprocess the spent fuel to extract the plutonium, then we have a fairly secure system in terms of criminals or terrorists or other would-be parties getting their hands on this weapons usable material. Once you start heading in the direction of using weapons grade material as fuel, then you have opened Pandora's box. So that's the main objection I would have. As far as the safety considerations go, I really think that those are not paramount. For the nuclear industry, the paramount consideration is how do we keep the ball rolling? How do we keep nuclear power expanding? How do we make nuclear power a success? And to do that, that's why they push the idea of thorium, of plutonium, and of fast reactors.
About the waste, yes, about thorium.
How about the oceans? Problem of bombs in the ocean and the submarines that might be down there. The submarines.
Yeah. Yes, that is indeed a very scary prospect. There are submarines which have gone to the bottom, and their reactors are there, full of irradiated nuclear fuel. That material will inevitably be getting out into the marine ecosystem. As you may know, they already went to great lengths to recover just one nuclear weapon which fell to the bottom of the sea near Spain, Palmera, Spain. One of the nuclear weapons that was dropped from a B-52 plane went to the bottom of the ocean, and they had a whole bunch of marine ships there retrieving that nuclear weapon. But they have not gone to similar lengths to retrieve these sunken nuclear submarines, and they are, in fact, a long-term danger because of the long-term elements such as you say, plutonium and the weapons usable uranium. Nuclear submarines are fueled with immediately weapons usable material. They're fueled with 93% enriched uranium, for example, which is the same stuff that was in the Hiroshima bomb. And that material is easy to make into an atomic bomb, even by someone who doesn't know a whole lot of nuclear physics, because it's a very simple device. It's what's called a gun-type nuclear weapon. And anybody who is experienced in explosives of a non-nuclear kind could fabricate a very powerful nuclear weapon from that degree of highly enriched uranium.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question. We're starting to run out of time, so.
I wonder, that's for comments.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Comment, recently Soviet Union launched one nuclear power plant on barge, on a ship. And they're planning to produce a lot more. So what do you think of this development? You know what I mean?
No, can you?
The Soviet Union developed a nuclear power plant on barge.
Okay.
On the barge.
On a ship.
Yeah.
It's Russia doing it now.
Okay. Can you hear that, Gordon?
I didn't quite understand it. It was a little bit confusing.
Russia's developing nuclear power plants on barges /
Oh.
Yes.
Yes, that's right. Floating nuclear power plants. Yes, I'm always amazed at the ingenuity of the nuclear industry. You have to realize, I believe that there's an element of Lord of the Rings here, combined with an element of expiation of guilt. I believe that the scientists are so thrilled with the prospect of tapping into this enormous power source. The most powerful force in the universe is the force that holds the nucleus of an atom together. And for a scientist not to be interested in that would defy credibility. On the other hand, we don't have any technology at the present to liberate that force that doesn't unleash terrible problems of an enormously long duration and enormously far-reaching consequences. And the result is that the scientific curiosity, which is understandable, has to be checked by political will. And I think that the people who realize that it's just not worth it to play these games when the upshot is contamination on a huge planetary scale. That's what I believe. And of course, this is going to be an ongoing debate for many years to come. But like it or not, even if the age of nuclear power is declining and might be on its way out, certainly in North America and Western Europe, nevertheless, the age of nuclear waste is just beginning, and we're going to have to, as a species on this planet, we're going to have to spend a lot of care and time looking after this legacy, which we cannot neutralize or render harmless.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're running out of time now. So if you have any further questions, Gordon, I know, is always very happy to answer questions, and you can send them to him. He's very good about email. And Angela is here for a little bit of time so people can come and talk with Angela afterwards.
If I might just say my email address, and I'm very glad for Richard to make that offer on my behalf. Because it's true. I wanted to give you my email address. It's simply 4 letters, CCNR, standing for Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility, @web.ca. And these are all very large subjects. If you'd like to know more about the plutonium economy, more about thorium reactors, or more about nuclear dangers, by all means, drop me an email and I'll do what I can to answer your questions. Thank you.